Hey guys, this is ADWCTA. Welcome to the Whispers of the Old God card review meta analysis thing. We're doing Rogue now, and Rogue is, as you guys know, the best class or the second best class, depending on who you ask in the arena. At least if you ask people who are really, really good at this game. And that's because it is quite possibly, and I don't have the stats to back this up, but I'm pretty sure it's true, the class that scales the most with skill. Meaning, if you are on average, your average, like I'll call it the class parity average, which means you play all. If you had played all classes evenly, this would be your average. The higher someone's average win rate for that goes, I think the higher disproportionately their average for Rogue will be compared to other classes. I think this is true for most people. Obviously, some people are better at some classes than others, but if you just overall took a census of all the good players, you'd probably come up with this conclusion. And it's because there's a total ton of options with Rogue, right? Like we said, one of the just the facts about Hearthstone and just games in general that are turn-based is the person who has to make the most decisions has a higher skill burden. The person who has to make fewer decisions has the lower skill burden. So if you're playing a class and you're like, I have made 4 decisions this game, and then you play another class and you're like, well, on turn 1 I had to think 4 turns ahead, and then each turn I made 5 decisions. Kind of a skill difference there, and so the good players will be better with that class. So Rogue is always very important to look at if you are a good player, especially to see what tricks that it may have up its sleeve. It's a very tricky class. Anyway, let's keep going. Review of the Old Gods meta. First, taunts are reactive, right? Someone drops a taunt, you get to do something to it. This is highly, highly helpful for the Rogue because Rogues can do a whole lot of things to it. It has eviscerate, backstab, blah, 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 blah. Almost more than any other class. I think actually just flat out more than any other class. Its single target removal is both the most flexible and the most thorough and the most frequently offered / drafted. You're just not going to get better than it. So the fact that the meta is turning into a taunt-based meta is actually pretty decent for the Rogue because a lot of the times your opponents will play a taunt and then expect it to taunt, and you would remove it, in which case it didn't really taunt any of your minions, and so you would get more face damage in. So the fact that taunts are reactive is very good for the Rogue. Also, taunts in general are good for the Rogue. You use your hero power as the Rogue, and you take a lot of face damage. So in the late game, when you can't heal, like, yes, direct damage will still kill you, but putting a taunt up makes you feel a lot safer, even if it's like a smaller taunt, right? Especially when you have the board at that point, presumably. If you also don't have the board, you're a little screwed. But presumably at that point, you have the board, or you just kind of like don't want your opponents to hit your face, and then you would win in a turn or two. So having taunts is kind of good for Rogue. You might think Rogue is aggressive and taunts are bad for it, but Rogue is less aggressive and more like aggro control style aggressive, where it just needs like 1 or 2 small things on the board, and it keeps removing your opponents every turn. Your opponent's minions every turn. And it doesn't really matter if your opponent's minions have taunt or not, because you're removing them. You're not like letting them stay on the board. Okay, so the bad part, of course, is what we're talking about. The hero power is limited. You will eventually run out of life, and then you no longer have a ping, and you instead have like a really weird version that's worse than the hunter's hero power. That's just going face, and it can get taunted. So, bad. And one more thing that's going to really work against the Rogue, actually, and this may be a little underappreciated, is that Rogue is really good at tempo. Around turn 3, 4, 5, when it can play 2 cards in a row, do a lot of tempo stuff, it can really overwhelm any other class in terms of tempo and get on the board. If you are just generally in a tempo meta, obviously that's huge, because you just won on tempo, and your opponent was relying on the tempo to do stuff. Your opponent no longer has the tempo to do stuff, your opponent no longer does stuff, and you win. Sometimes the game is just that easy. But if you are in a more card advantage, defensive, taunting, healing, board clear, removal, whatever kind of meta, right? You can get the tempo in the mid game, but now it's not going to matter as much, right? Like if your opponent can out taunt you, if your opponent plays 6 taunts in a row, you're going to throw a couple minions into that. So the Rogue really is more of a board flip kind of game, board flip aggro control, which is not, like I said, it's not bad that your opponents have taunts and go slower, but you really have to manage it. Like, you kind of have to figure out when it's the right opportunity to blow all your cards and throw them at the board. And when you can just be like, well, let's just keep it going a little, keep it going a little. Like, wait for your opponent to do something before you do something back. And so it's a lot more about managing your resources now in this new meta than it used to be. It used to be pretty clear that your opponents are going to tempo, you're going to tempo, and once you flip the board, you win. Now you may have to wait a little longer for your opponents to tempo. But they have to tempo eventually. If they don't, they're going to keep taking face damage, and it's just not going to be good for them. Anyway, so not a huge deal, but definitely something to consider. And also something to consider when we say something like, or when I say something like, oh, the tempo is going to be more control, there's going to be a lot more taunts. The taunts thing I actually quantified, right? 2.5 times. But when I say it's going to be a little slow, I really just mean like 1 to 2 turns slower. I don't mean like, oh, this is going to be like all the decks you currently see won't be viable in the new arena. It's not like that. The arena shifts slowly. So you're doing something like when I say everything's getting slower, I'm saying like maybe if right now it's 30% aggro, 50% mid-range, and 20% control, it's going to shift to be more like 15% aggro, still 40% mid-range, and then 35% control, which it will still feel like the arena, but now it's very different in that you'll be facing control decks almost like double the frequency. And I think that's about right. I think you'll face control decks going forward at least double the frequency that you currently face them. And it's not like they're not at the meta right now. Like, more than a quarter of mages, I think, are control right now. And some other classes do some control decks, too. So, it's all relative. And the more frequently you see control decks, the more your deck really needs a game plan of how to win. Or else you're just going to lose some games very quickly, and you'll never get your average above, like, 4. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about OE changes. There's a bunch of changes happening with the Rogue in OE. The first thing to know about OE is that it was really good for the Rogue. Like, really good. Pit Snake, really good card. Tomb Pillager, really good card. Unearthed Raptor, really good card. And then look back on it, and TGT was really good for the Rogue too. Buccaneer, Undercity Valiant, all common class cards. I'm not sure how many people were on board with the idea that Rogue was the best class before TGT, but it's something important to remember that it's just become more and more obvious that Rogue is super good, partly because they keep getting these really, really good cards. And these really, really good cards are getting offering bonuses. And on top of all of that, these really, really good cards are also small. Pit Snake is 1 mana, Buccaneer is 1 mana, Undercity Valiant is 2 mana, Unearthed Raptor is 3 mana, Tomb Pillager is 4 mana. All that is going to kind of change. So now what you're going to see is that we're going to get a bunch of cards that all slow the game down for the Rogue. So it's going to be a very, very different feel. And remember what we said, right? When the whole meta slows down, the faster you go, the better it is, right? Like, if your deck is speed 4, you're going to lose to a deck that's speed 5. If 10 is super slow and 1 is super fast, if your deck is a speed 4 and you face a deck that's speed 5, you're at a disadvantage. But if your deck is speed 6 and you face a deck that's speed 1, the speed 6 deck is at a disadvantage. So as the Rogue, one of the ways with all this like good reach and good like tempo is that you can always make a deck that goes really fast and flips the board and make sure your opponent can't do anything and aggro control your way to victory. It's going to get a little harder. So that's important to know. Also, let's go over the buffs really quickly. Master of Disguise got nerfed. And now no longer Stealthster guy forever. It was a long time coming. I'm surprised it took him this long to nerf it. Because the Rogue used to have a lot of stealth mechanics if you were a player back in like Alpha or like Closed Beta. And they like nerfed all of them so that you can't do this. Because if you could just hide something with an ability on the board, it's kind of insanely powerful. And now they don't allow it. It gives them more design space. It's really more of a constructed thing, but you could see it potentially affecting Arena too. In terms of the impact here, though, it's very little, right? There's very few things that you would want to keep stealth forever anyway. Bloody Fury also got nerfed, and I know people are upset about this in Constructed or whatever, but I love this for the Arena. Remember, Arena is all about class flavor and class weaknesses. Rogue has a weakness, or its weakness was that it can't deal massive amounts of damage all over the board. It hits one thing at a time. It has a lot of cards that hit one thing at a time, and it has very flexibility. It's very flexible about how much it can hit something for, but it's single target, and that fits the Rogue because it's a freaking Rogue. It has a fan of knives, and that's it. Blade Flurry allows for combos that could potentially be insane and win you the game and break all expectations. So getting rid of this card, or not getting rid of it, but making it really insanely bad, is a good thing in my book. And it doesn't affect Rogue that much anyway. Blade Flurry was never like the greatest card due to its heavy combo nature, but it's going to make facing the Rogue a lot more safe. So moving on, new cards for the Rogue. The first card I want to talk about is a card called Shadowcaster. It is an epic. You may think, oh, it's an epic, I'm never going to see it. It's true, but for a totally different reason. You're never going to see it because it sucks. It basically draws you a card at the cost of 1.5 tempo, and that card, only if you had used it on a minion with a really good like death rattle or some kind of other ability, would even be good to play in the first place. And that card still costs an extra mana to play, and it only has a 1/1 body. Like, it's really slow. It's super designed for card advantage, and it's a combo card. It's not awful, but it's definitely not good. But what I want to talk about at first is to remind you guys of the Athiuen effect, which is that these are two epic cards. Blade of Athiuen is the other epic card, which means Shadowcaster, rather than being seen 33% time, and I'm just pulling 33 like randomly, right? It could be 25, it could be 40, it could be 30, who knows? But whatever extra offering rate bonus that Whispers of the Old Gods meta gets, this will get double that, because there's only two cards. We talked about it before in the context of the Warlock with rare cards, and then there were with common cards, and then there were 3 there. But there's only 2 because it's an epic, and so because there's only 2, this epic card is going to have an offering rate bonus compared to other class cards. So class cards already have double the offering rate of neutral cards. So if you compare a Shadowcaster to a neutral epic card, it will have an offering bonus of like 5 times. Like, it's very not intuitive, but that's how the game works, and so you'll see this kind of frequently. And it's not a good card, so it's not like terribly important, but this is the kind of effect that can happen when you do things like remove Athiuen from the game. There's something to keep in mind. Let's talk about a card that will actually matter in the arena. The giant theme for Rogue, like I was talking about, is slow. Right? More than any other class, the Rogue is going to slow down. And we'll go over all the cards that make the Rogue slow down. Let's start with Southsea Squidface. Southsea Squidface is a 4-mana 4/4. It is a common card. It is a good card because the Death Rattle gives you a Poison Dagger. It's a little limiting because you kind of have the dagger out already. It's to make sure your opponent doesn't remove it and then leave you with nothing. And then your dagger doesn't quite get the initiative. So it's not like as good as saying, well, it's a 4-mana card that gives you a free Poison Dagger. But it does end up with kind of the same effect. So it's also a pirate. Pirates, rogues, really good. You're getting a couple more pirate synergies, a couple more weapon synergies in this expansion. And that's all good. It's going to be a good card. It's not a brokenly good card, but it is a good card. And it is slow, right? 4-mana 4/4 will lose you the board. You may play it in the late game. You have to dagger up before you play this card, and daggering up and not attacking takes 2 mana. That's slow. And the dagger that you're going to get won't have initiative if your opponent removes it. It will if you are the one that kills off the Southsea Squidface. But you get the idea. A little bit slower than what the Rogue is generally used to. And we're not done here, right? Like, let's look at all the rare cards. Every one of the rare cards. Journey Below, excellent card. Discover Death Rattle. We saw Museum Curator. This is Museum Curator without the useless body for 1 mana less. Definitely a good thing. And it's going to get you a really powerful Death Rattle card because Death Rattles are really powerful. But it is slow. You just spent 1 mana to do nothing. Well, you may use it to trigger a combo or something too, right? So like Journey Below is like quite a step up from Museum Curator. Now, Undercity Huckster, 2 mana 2/2. Not very good tempo, but it adds a random class card to your hand from your opponent's class, so it's like a loot hoarder that can't be pinged and has 1 more health. Pretty good. The card you get's a little worse, but regardless, it's a good card. You'll see it, you'll play it. It's better than average, and it is slow. Thistle Tea, draw a card, add 2 extra copies of it to your hand. You draw 3 cards instead of 4 for 1 less mana, so it's not that good compared to Sprit, but it's not unplayable. You'll see it sometimes, and it is slow, which kind of, you get the idea. things are slowing down for the Rogue, and that's not a good thing. That is not a good thing. So while individually these cards are actually fairly powerful, the Rogue is not like doing insane things in this expansion, because all of the cards are making it slow at a time when if you are the Rogue, you actually want to go fast. You don't want to hang around more, because your hero power becomes more and more useless. You want to play aggro control, and these cards don't help. So then we're going to go talk about the other two, the two common class cards that are left that we haven't talked about yet, because they're not slow. So it's not all bad for the Rogue. In fact, one of the cards is very good. We'll get to that last. Bladed Cultist is the first one I want to talk about, just because it's interesting and you'll see it. Like, it's good enough that it's better than your average card, and so you'll pick it. But it's not as good as you may think it is. It's a 1 mana 1/2 that combos to become a 1 mana 2/3. 1 mana 2/3s are good, but you're never going to play this on turn 1. You can't. And 1 mana cards are good for the Rogue because they're combo triggers, but you can't use this card as a combo trigger because it itself is a combo. In reality, you'll probably use it as a combo trigger sometimes, just because its combo effect is not all that great compared to the combo effects of pretty much every other combo effect. So it will just be used as a combo trigger sometimes, but then you just get a 1/2 body. It's not a very great card. Otherwise, you eventually throw it out on like turn like 3 or 4 with like some other cards, and you get a nice 2/3 body, which is good, right? Like, but it's not as good as you may think. Like, it's not as good as what 1 mana 2/3 seems to suggest. So it's definitely not one of the Rogue's like top cards. So don't look at it and think like, oh, Rogue's gonna be able to go fast again. No, it is excellent for aggro control style. Like, you use a removal and then you play a Bladed Cultist because you have 1 mana hanging instead of like daggering or something. That's very good. So it does fit the game, the style of the Rogue very well. Just the power of the card itself is limited. And remember, smaller cards are less good in this meta because everything's going to shift a little slower, so you want like a little bigger. And even if you want to go fast, you can afford to be like a little bigger, maybe, depending on what you're doing, right? And Rogue always has Sprint, which lets it kind of compete in card advantage with the other classes. So it's a very interesting card, but just overall, don't overestimate its value. It is better than average. I just think people tend to get carried away with cards like these. And the thing with Bladed Cultist is, this is why I'm not comparing it to any 1-drops. It's not a 1-drop. It's not a 1-drop at all. It's a 1 mana. It's essentially a 1 mana spell that ends up putting a minion on your board later on. Like, that's how you got to treat it. So it's kind of pointless to compare it with 1 mana cards. You can maybe compare it to something like Light of Naru or something, right? Like, it's more like that than it is like an actual 1-drop. Okay, Shadow Strike is the common Rogue card that will change the game and change the meta. We talked about in Paladin how it was, I'm gonna get Divine Strength, Blessing of Strength is the card that will change the meta when it comes to the Paladin. Shadow Strike will change the meta when it comes to the Rogue. It is that important. And it is that important not only because it is a very powerful card. 3 mana, 5 damage is insanely good. And generally, the fact that it needs to be undamaged doesn't really matter. Like, how many times are you going to want to deal 5 damage to a damaged minion? Like, not that often. And technically, you could go face with it too if your opponent hasn't lost health. But don't do that. That's like, don't do it. Don't do it. So Shadow Strike is 3 mana, 5 damage, very good ratio, right? Fireball has the same kind of... Fireball actually has a worse ratio, but has the same kind of like 2 damage bonus on its mana cost. You never get a 2 damage bonus on a mana cost with a straight removal, unless you're Rogue and it's a backstab. And this kind of fits the backstab theme. But the more important part is that it's dealing 5 damage. Nothing deals 5 damage. This is the big giant hole that kind of governs how the arena has worked since Classic. The idea that nothing deals 5 damage. Why is Yeti good? Nothing deals 5 damage. Why is just having 5 health in general on anything good? It's like almost something you just... It's a midpoint in the arena meta. And it's so central to understanding how the arena works beyond just like adding numbers for card advantage and tempo and all of that. The fact that nothing deals 5 damage skews the entire arena meta around that area, that breakpoint of when you can get 5 health. That's why Senjin is so good. Shadow Strike goes a huge way towards breaking that hold. To give you an idea, literally the only common class card that deals 5 damage on curve, right? So like without needing to do something crazy, is Arcanite Reaper for 5 mana. and that's you usually deal more damage than your mana cost, right? And that doesn't. And that's from a warrior, and no one cares because no one plays warrior. You never see warriors in the arena. And Druid has Starfire, which deals 5 damage, but that's not until 6 mana. You're like so off curve by that point. And again, Druid is also not the most popular class in the arena. I don't know why Druid is not more popular. It's kind of like if you start off with Mage, as everyone does, you're like, well, here's another class with a hero power that does the same thing. Let's use it. But whatever, it's just not popular. Rogue is also not the most popular class in the arena, but it is definitely more popular than the Warrior and the Druid, and more importantly, Shadow Strike is a much better card than Arcanite Reaper. It is it's a better card than Arcanite Reaper, or at least it's around the level of Arcanite Reaper. It's definitely a better card than Starfire. And it is coming in a class that is more popular than both of those classes, and even if it wasn't, it still just adds to the realm of things you have to fear. Compare that to 4 damage. Who deals 4 damage? True Silver, Paladin, most popular class. Mage, Flame Cannon for only 2 mana, right? Like most popular or second most popular class. Rogue, Eviscerate, 4 damage. Again, one of the more popular classes. And then you could go on, right? Warlock deals 4 damage in all sorts of ways. Druid with Swipe deals 4 damage. The Warrior with that thing... Heroic Strike, also 2 mana, deals 4 damage, or Death's Bite also deals 4 damage. Am I missing some classes? Priest doesn't really deal doesn't deal damage at all, so they're on a whole different system. I won't worry about Priest right now. What am I? 2 more classes left. I don't know what 2 classes I'm forgetting right now. Shaman. Okay, Shaman has trouble dealing 4 damage. That's like one of the things about Shaman. And now they don't have trouble dealing 4 damage anymore with Stormcrack. Kind of interestingly. So now they also have Stormcrack to deal 4 damage. And the one class I haven't talked about when it comes to 4 damage is Hunter. Right, okay, fine. Hunter can deal 5 damage if it already has a beast on the board. Again, that's highly situational with Kill Command. It's not going to happen. And Hunter doesn't have a good way of dealing 4 damage also. So Hunter is the only class without a good way of dealing 4 damage now. Right? So having 4 health is really, really, really bad. Everything can deal 4 damage. Having 5 health, you are heavily limited in the classes that can deal 4 damage, and it's heavily skewed towards classes that people don't play. Now, meta broken, right? Rogue is here, Shadow Strike is here, it's an insanely good card, it's high tempo, it deals 5 damage, watch out Yetis, watch out Senjins. I don't want to overstate its importance, it's still not on Mage, it's not on Paladin, but it does go a long way towards it. If I were Blizzard, I would quickly design more cards that deal 5 damage. I would give Hunter a steady 5 damage card, and not just like Kill Command, but like maybe like a 4 mana 5 damage card. I would give Mage a 5 damage card because Mage deals damage on the whole spectrum, right? They're a Mage. That's kind of something that they do, and so that I think is going to be it wouldn't break the flavor of the class to do it, and that would be a nice thing. And Warlock and Druid, I wouldn't be sad if they got 5 damage dealers because they don't have hard removals. So you can just kind of increase the size in which they can take care of to 5 health, which is not at all absurd. And they're still limited in their same kind of weaknesses. So those are classes that I think should have 5 damage removals, and they don't. And so right now, Yetis are still going to be disproportionately powerful. Anything with 5 health is going to be disproportionately powerful. That 5th health is worth more than the healths before it, and more than the healths coming after it. That's a very important thing about the arena meta. And Shadow Strike kind of makes it go down a little. And this is good. This is good. It was always kind of just a weird quirk of how the cards were being published, that 5 health was so important. And it's good that it's getting a little diminished in terms of importance. Alright, that's kind of it. That's it for the Rogue. Final rank, 6.5 out of 10. It's okay. Like I said, right, Rogue is losing a lot of good cards, and all of these cards, except for Shadow Strike, the other good ones are all a little on the slow and awkward side. Shadow Strike is really the good bomb that's carrying the Rogue forward in this expansion, but between how the expansion itself is kind of turning a little on the Rogue, and the fact that their cards, although decently powerful, all kind of go towards a style that they're not used to, and also a style that's just not as good for the Rogue as a more fast style with lower mana costing cards, more things that can trigger combos as they were getting before. So Rogue is going to do okay, and doing okay where it is right now is not good for it. because it's so high up. So I think you're going to see the top classes kind of come down again. We're going to do Mage next, and I'll tell you what I think about the Mage. But overall, I think one of the effects of this expansion is that the middle zone of classes are kind of being lifted up to meet the very top classes, which are getting Paladin aside, which are getting like a tiny bit more towards the middle, while classes like Hunter and Priest, I don't know. We'll get into a talk about that when we talk about Priest to finish things up. Next up, we're going to do the Mage. First, these are our Patreons. Thanks for feeding the goat. If you're thinking about feeding the goat and supporting us and the arena content for the arena community, it is at patreon.com/grinninggoat. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next episode.